Welcome everybody. Language, writing and words are essential to our lives. And for some people, they're a passion and fundamental to their livelihoods. Our guests in today's webinar are three such people. With them, we're going to explore the intricacies of English, what we mean by style, in language that is, the benefits of writing clearly and much, much more. Chris Hammer is a former newspaper and TV journalist turned best-selling, award-winning author of non-fiction and crime fiction. Dr. Amanda Laugesen is Director of the Australian National Dictionary Centre at the ANU and a leading expert on the cultural history of Australian English. She's also an author of many award-winning books. And Chaz Savage is the founder and CEO of Ethos CRS, where we are today. He's a clear writing expert and has a background in policy analysis and speech writing. Now, we'd love you to participate in today's webinar. If you want to send in questions or comments, please send them to the chat function and we will get to them later. So first of all, I'd like to come to Amanda and to Chaz. You were both intricately involved in updating the new Australian Government Style Manual with this digital-only product, not a book. We're going to look at some of the specifics of the changes in style. But first of all, what do we even mean by style in language? Amanda.
Well, thanks, Kate. I think this is a really good question because when you posed this question, I was thinking, well, what do we mean when we talk about style? And to me, I think there's perhaps two different ways of thinking about it. One are the kind of rules and guidelines that we use. So we need a style guide or a style manual to help us in the kind of writing and publishing that we do. And then on the other hand, we also want to think about writing in terms of being stylish. So I'm thinking of, Strunk & White's The Elements of Style. What makes stylish writing? What makes effective communication? So I think both of those elements are equally important in thinking about language and style and writing. And Chaz might have some more views on that.
Well, I was really pleased that you said style in language, because when we won the job, a friend of mine said, this is fantastic. If you could just make a rule that people should not wear fleecies in the office, that'd be a really stylish step forward. But on language, if we are going to be so constrained, the question of style for me goes to the point first off of communicating complex ideas clearly. So if you're writing in a company, in government, your job is to set people up for understanding and success. And the wrong style subverts that objective. And the hallmarks for good business writing or good professional writing are accuracy, brevity and clarity. So ABC. Now that doesn't address style in fiction or elegance in style at all. It is mechanical. It is formulaic to a degree, but it's underpinned by the idea that people's lives are too short, our attention spans are different as modern readers, and good style caters for the needs of audiences and users.
Chris, I'm going to come to you a little bit later about style in your fields of writing, so don't feel excluded. Amanda, what were some of the big changes that occurred between the old Commonwealth Style Manual from 18 years ago and the current online only?
Well, I think one of the big differences is that in fact it is an online-only style manual, and I think that goes to the real change, one of the real changes here, which is the shift to increasing online communication and forms of communication, the impact of things like social media. So there needed to be guidelines around how you might manage social media or communicate in a social media or a blog, how you might style things for online publication versus print publication. So those kinds of issues all had to be dealt with in the new style manual. So that's one of the really big areas that needed to be addressed, and that is different from the previous style manual. One of the other important things, I think, is really an updating and a shift in our understanding around diverse and inclusive language. So making sure that those things were addressed. And I think being a lot more conscious of the need to consult, so to consult with communities about how they best wanted the language to reflect their groups, their language. So I think inclusive and diverse language was something that I'd be really proud of in terms of the updates that have applied in the new version of the style manual. I mean, these things change over time, so it was informed by changes in our understanding around this kind of language. But I do think that's one of the things that's really important to point to and be proud of in the new style manual.
And the changes around gender and sexual diversity, it's such a dramatic shift, isn't it? Just in quite a short time to see that reflected in an official publication.
That's right. And that kind of language changes quite rapidly as well. So we've seen a shift, to use an example, from disabled person to person with a disability. That's happened fairly rapidly. The take-up of gender-neutral pronouns in more recent times. So these things are hugely important in terms of recognising the diversity of the Australian community.
Mm. Chaz, what leapt out at you, some of the big changes?
Well, picking up Amanda's point about going online, the online readership is different. You know, a lifetime ago, university education was caste-based in this country. So very few Australians went to university, and those who did were of a particular type. Now information published by government has to be available to all and available online. So to be accessible is a really important feature of government writing. Your text must serve the needs not just of an elite, not just of those who are highly educated, but those people who are from different non-English speaking backgrounds, those people who don't have a degree in English literature, those people whose reading level is actually that of the 44% of Australians who read at a Year 7 level. That doesn't mean they're not expert in other things, they're not smart, they're not funny, but this is how they read. And so that accessibility shift is really important. It wasn't there in print.
No, I don't even recall accessibility even being mentioned in the old style manual. Oh. Chris, what's your opinion of style manuals? You've worked in the media for many, many years where media organisations have their own style manuals, publishing houses have their own style manuals. Are they helpful? Are they even consulted?
Yeah, sure they are. There's a couple of points to it. One is you want to write with power and clarity, whether you're communicating an idea or an emotion, a policy, whatever. But the English language is massively broad. So what the style manuals are helping you do is make sure everyone's using the same language. So if a word in a newspaper article means one thing one day, that it doesn't mean something else at another time, that you're not insulting a group of people by using the wrong term, for example. Sometimes it's just clarity. So, for example, in the old Fairfax style guide, jail was always spelt J-A-I-L, just for clarity as people brushed over rather than the English spelling G-A-O-L. So what Amanda was saying, there is, part of it's sets of rules, if you like, kind of constraints, but the useful of that isn't to constrain you, it's so you can write more effectively with more power.
This question of literacy levels and the Australian population, 44% reading to a level of 44% reading to a Year 7 level. Do you think, Amanda, you think that figure's about right? And is that because of our big migrant base? Or is it a reflection of our education system, or both?
I think that's not my area of research and expertise. Chaz might be able to better address this.
Because literacy is fundamental to a fundamental issue to the new style manual, isn't it?
So the data we use is from the Bureau of Statistics, 2012 from memory. I will check. But it doesn't give that a regional or demographic breakdown. So it's one size fits all. Here are our levels. 44% read to this level. But reasonably, Australia is a language of, Australia is a country of migrants. Not everyone comes here with English language under their belt as their first language of choice. And so the needs for us are to cater to these groups in our community who aren't as comfortable. And that comes in two ways. If people are going to the English language source, that has to be clear as possible. But if groups are reading translations, then the task of translation is made easier if the source English document is clear, accurate, brief and clear.
I would say broadsheet newspapers, I forget what the readership age they're aiming at. It's like year 8 or year 9. So maybe slightly higher for the Fin Review, the tabloids, primary school level. Doesn't mean that you can't communicate sophisticated ideas. Doesn't mean they can't report on the federal budget. And the point I would make is, why would you use, particularly if you're communicating to the public, and dare I say it, if you're communicating, say, with politicians who may not be expert in the field, why would you use complex language if you could use simple language? If you can do it with simple language, do it with simple language.
And it's a skill that can be learnt. This type of writing is not necessarily something that comes naturally to a lot of people. You can actually learn the techniques to write this way, which is, I guess, the point of having a style manual, isn't it? Yeah. What about some of the changes that relate to accessibility, which have riled many of the language nerds out there? And I'm thinking of N-dashes, M-dashes, the things that a lot of us kind of love. M-dashes in my case. Does it matter? Does it matter that we give these up? I'm just wondering, is it only language nerds that really bother about this, or do we just have to get over it and just go with the 21st century changes?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, as somebody who works editing dictionaries and gets a lot of complaints from the public about various words that people are particularly attached to, and I think the same thing happens with style, that there are things that are our personal style preferences, or that we've grown up, you know, we were taught this when we were at school and we should continue to use this. But as with language, I think style changes, and some of that will be about accessibility or readability on a screen. Sometimes it's simply because the trend has moved. You know, I think, for example, hyphenated words increasingly will be solid rather than hyphenated. And that seems to be a trend that's happening in language. And so we're seeing a kind of simplification, if you like, of some of these things. In the style manual, I mean, some of the more boring things are moving away from, for example, from Latin abbreviations, which a lot of people don't understand, don't know, weren't taught. So I think it is about accessibility and inclusivity, so a broader range of people can understand these things. But yeah, I think there will always be people who will be particularly attached to their own thing. M-dashes, I wouldn't necessarily die in a ditch over, but I know other people feel very passionately about that. And I think that's the thing about language and style. It is something we will have our own personal passions, and it can be hard to change some of those things with individuals.
And I guess we just have to remember it's all about accessibility. It's really fundamental to this new style manual, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to think about online communication. Things that will be presented on a screen are going to have different requirements to things that, you know, used to be printed on a page. So I think thinking about those things is important. It may not be something you necessarily like, but it's important to keep that in mind.
Chris, to what extent do you think about language style when you're writing journalism, I think you've touched on that, but also when you're writing your non-fiction books and your crime fiction books, are you consciously thinking about the words that you're choosing?
Oh, absolutely. Right down to each and every word. Part of my background was as a television reporter, and on TV news it's often very cliched, but that's a shorthand. It's a way of getting complex ideas over quickly. But say in long form documentary, you're actually writing in 3 languages. You're writing in the spoken word and the pictures and the soundtrack, and it makes you very conscious of how they interact and how the less you speak, the more space there is for other stuff, and that's flowed over into fiction, for example. You really are conscious in the broad scope of style, which is often expressed as voice, the author's voice in a particular book. Consistency of style tends to be very important throughout non-fiction and fiction. So you don't want one voice at the start of a book and it starting to vary or inconsistency, because you'll lose the reader. The reader's actually moving into your world. So most fiction is trying to be immersive, to bring people in. And so style, the choice of the words and the flow of the words really affects the story, how people are perceiving the story. So the story can't be separated at all from the language used. And most writers, this isn't an ironclad rule, because some writers will deliberately make their language challenging because they want people to stop and think. But that's the exception almost that proves the rule. Most writers will be aiming for good accessibility. They won't be using the overly complex language or overly complex sentence structure, for example, because for them the story is paramount, the characters and the voices of the characters and whatever. A good example is dialogue. Some writers find it difficult to write dialogue because it tends to be a condensation to trying to capture the natural flow, the way people speak. But if you wrote down verbatim how people speak, it would be very woolly and ungrammatical and hard to follow. So you're trying to get the essence of it and the impression of it, but actually with different language altogether. So there is a great deal of, any book's probably going to go, I mean, my books I probably do at least 3 or 4 drafts. Then it goes to publishing, you're going to go through 3 or 4 edits. So every word's been gone over 7 or 8 times by the time it's actually in print. So yeah, there's an immense amount of effort put into each and every word.
But when I was reading your second crime novel, I haven't read your non-fiction, I'm sorry, but when I was reading Silver, at one point I had this really conscious thought, he's not using many adverbs.
And often that's almost subconscious, intuitive. You get the voice, you get the style, and you're in the story as the writer, and so your style is reflecting your state of mind. Yeah. That's when it works well. It doesn't always work well.
And of course we know from research that crime fiction actually does have short sentences, a lot shorter than non-fiction.
Yeah, and look, some of it's really beautifully written. You know, Peter Temple here in Australia, winner of the Miles Franklin Award. People like, I guess, John le Carre. And then you get stuff that is just appalling.
Right. We don't have to buy it.
Thrillers. Hey?
We don't have to buy it or read it, do we?
No, it's a very broad church, but some of it, it's gobsmackingly bad.
Do you feel like technology is changing the way you write? The changes in technology?
Look, clearly there's been a big leap from people writing longhand or even typing, because you can correct. I'm a screen native, of course. Writing on a computer, editing on a computer. The final edits are all way still done on paper, that's because you're checking the typesetting as well as the style and the words and the spelling and all that sort of thing. But certainly and it means you're not posting stuff backwards and forwards, and yeah, there's a whole lot of stylistic input that you can get from different people. So certainly technology has changed the way that people work.
What about the evolution of English by the development of technology? Because you've gone back to convict English, Australian convict English, and I mean, how different is that from even 100 years later? Do you think that technology is going to change our language's evolution?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways in which technology is changing our language. I mean, I think the online environment in a way is exposing us to a greater diversity of language. So trends in social media, you know, a hashtag is now becoming a term, Me Too, for example, where it's sort of evolved from a hashtag to something you would read in journalism at least. So that's one way in which you're seeing, so you know, things like that are coming out in social media, slang words, a whole variety of new words that come into usage very quickly. They potentially fade out just as quickly, but we now can track them. We're now much more aware of them, I think, than we once were. So slang might have been a lot. Particular slang words might have been very localised, not very widespread, but now can become popular internationally very quickly. So that's one way in which we're seeing some shifts thanks to technology.
Chaz, what about in the language of government and business? Are you seeing big changes caused?
Well, government and business face the same challenges as anybody whose readership has shifted online. So there's a couple of points. Our audiences are just as smart, just as inspiring, just as competent as 100 years ago, 50 years ago. But they consume information in different ways. So online, I mean, Chris talked about, as a journalist, communicating at 3 different levels. Well, as someone who's writing for publication online, you're competing against funny cat videos. You're learning stuff on YouTube. So my first car, God, it was a piece of crap. I really need the service manual published by Ford. And it was about as big as a Besser brick, and, you know, I learned how to change your gearbox and I spent all my time fixing that damn car. But it was in print. These days, you just go online. You watch the video and you learn from that. So people absorb information in different ways. And that has real implications for us as writers. You know, if you want to communicate, then understand that people will go elsewhere. People don't, the other thing that, and this is anecdotal rather than driven by research, the stories I hear are a very smart group of people who are absolutely expert in assembling information from diverse sources. But the grinding discipline of starting from premises and working through to conclusions, which is like a book, is something that has perhaps changed over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting research that suggests that we've moved from that kind of deep reading model to we're skimming across the surface and shallow reading. I mean, that's a stereotype because I think lots of people still do deep reading. But I think certainly the way we sort of get information from various sources means we read differently. And as you say, grabbing attention is so much harder in a world where pretty much everybody's voices can potentially be heard.
You only have to be on public transport to realise everyone's on a device.
When I was at Fairfax, they were redesigning the newspapers initially to go from broadsheet to tabloid size for Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. But what had been developed was eye scanning technology, so they could monitor people reading. what they realised is hardly anyone ever finished a news story. They'd read maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs and then they'd go on to the next one. And it was really interesting to see how people actually read and what would work and what would retain people's interest through a story. And so there was this idea that people had developed ideas how people read, but there was no empirical evidence, because how could you possibly know until they got this technology? So any really sophisticated sort of website is doing that using that technology when they design what people read. So if things have changed, if you're at home and you're thinking, oh, my newspaper looks different, or even what's online looks different than 5 years ago, it's probably being driven by that sort of research.
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of frightening when you find out just how long people might spend on a web page. It's just a few seconds, and if you haven't grabbed their attention, it's on to something else. And I think that has real
really
implications.
Disappointed in hearing that today,
Yeah, it has real implications for how you present information, or what's the core information you want to put there.
So today, every publication will have a winners and losers from the budget, because someone did some research about 10 years ago and it demonstrated that was the most popular in that whole, back in the days when you got, like a 32-page lift out, that was the one that people watched, and that was what they watched on the ABC and whatever. So now everybody does it, and that's why.
Now more than ever, probably, because we've got even less time. Does all this mean we're not going to be reading complex books? Fiction, non-fiction? Is the audience for this type of product, is it getting smaller and smaller? What do you, Chris?
This year's a bit different because of COVID. There's been a big leap in readership of fiction because people, I guess, want to escape. But the trend over the last several years with books is non-fiction has increasingly done better. So this is book-sized non-fiction stuff, factual stories, histories, biographies, whatever. Clearly, maybe it's a reaction that they're no longer getting it from, say, broadsheet newspapers, whatever. But no, there's still an appetite there for long-form non-fiction.
Yeah, it is true that our love of complexity hasn't changed. I mean, I think of the invention of The Sopranos as an epic, which is delivered in what was an entirely new medium, and how sophisticated we've become in reading and interpreting television. So, and our sophistication allows complexity to be built in there. If you compare The Sopranos to, say, I'm picking an Academy Award winning movie from the 60s, Spartacus, which starred Kirk Douglas's chin mainly, as far as I can tell. The tropes, what was displayed, has really changed, and that has implications for us again as writers. So if we love complexity still, but our preferred medium is not the printed word, the word that's to be read, then how do we communicate complex ideas clearly? And that takes us back to the beginning, in a sense. That's what the Style Manual as a project was all about.
So Chaz, you wrote a piece for the Canberra Times on the weekend about the economic benefits that can accrue if public servants write clearly, and by extension that the Style Manual's guidance is followed. Is that message reaching the right ears, that if we follow this advice and we write more clearly, it will have these benefits that go far beyond just communication?
Well, there are two aspects to it. So clear writing, writing style is not necessarily clear thinking. But if your style is clear and your expression is clear, that reveals really quickly that your thinking is just rubbish. And clear thinking is the inflatable that keeps organisations afloat. No clear thinking, no effective organisation, no good projects. Everything just collapses into rubbish. So clear writing is a tool that helps organisations make good decisions at the right time that result in value. The public service delivers a better program. A private organisation delivers a better service or product to clients. So the point here is those decisions are made very often on the basis of paper or a written document, a project proposal or a business case or a ministerial brief, and if you produce that well, a good decision's made quickly. The second thing is, and it goes to the point about organisational practice. If you have a consistent style that is understood, then the arguments about how many angels dance on the head of a pin, should we use an M dash, should we use an N dash, I prefer commas here, I prefer commas there, that bedevil organisations are just stripped away so that smart professionals can focus on what's important, which again is the ideas. Don't make people fight over stuff that's not important, or make people focus on what's important by giving them a style manual to assist. And so the benefits are twofold. Create value, that's the most important, but also just be more efficient in what you do. And a style manual and discipline in applying that is just at the heart of the public service, which is, when you think about it in the first instance, just a thinking and writing machine. That's all it is. Think about things, write about them, get good decisions, implement, rinse and repeat.
On that point, I think we'll move to questions. So we've got quite a few questions from our viewers and listeners, which is lovely. The first question I think might be for you, Chris. Have you received any criticism for use of incorrect, insensitive language for any published work?
Not personally that I can think of. My crime fiction has swear words in it, which not actually in the narrative, but in people's dialogue. But that's in character. Some people might get offended by that, but that's fine because I know what I'm doing. It's been done deliberately with that risk. I worked at SBS for a long time, and you have to be very sensitive there with the use of different languages to describe Indigenous issues, for example. For example, if someone's deceased, can you use their name or not? Do you have to go to the family, whatever? There was, when I was working in SBS, some foreign policy areas, you know, the use of the word Macedonia was completely fraught. Gareth Evans tried to insist that the ABC and SBS use the delightful acronym FIROM, standing for the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia.
I remember it well.
So yeah, and once again, to get back to what Chaz was saying, you don't want to have a fight about that. You don't want intelligent people fighting over the correct or incorrect use of, you know, Aboriginal or Aborigine or something like that. You want people focused on the substance of the issue, not the language. And I guess that's why a style guide can be so important. So, you know, whether it's a public service or it's newspapers or whatever, you want the focus on the concepts and the issues, not on the language.
Amanda, would that question apply to anything you've written? Any criticism for use of incorrect or insensitive language for anything you've published?
Well, I think, well, I've got a book on swear words and slurs about to come out, so I may well get some flack for that. But no, I mean, in the dictionary world, I think one of the interesting things that we have occasionally received criticism for is the inclusion of words. So, you know, we're descriptive, we're describing words that are in the language. We would always label words as derogatory or offensive, depending on their nature. But we have had people write to us and ask us to take those words out of the dictionary. So actually even including it in the dictionary is seen to somehow be sanctioning their use and their existence. So I think that's it. I think we included one which I won't repeat, but the person complained because their child had been bullied, and they didn't want us to actually even have the word in the dictionary. So, and that is a tricky thing, but we are describing the language. We always think very carefully about how we label things, and increasingly we look very carefully at things like how the definition is worded. I know Oxford dictionaries in the UK have received criticism for some of their, because they provide examples of usage, and that's drawn from their vast corpus of material. So they've copped some flack from feminists over some of the usages being sexist or misogynist. So I think that's quite an interesting example, because that tends to be just sort of, I think, automatically drawn from their corpus. So there's not necessarily an editor carefully looking through all of those examples, but in fact you do need to be quite sensitive, because some of the examples that you're citing may in fact be offensive. So there are some interesting issues there, I think.
Now, the last style manual was written almost 20 years ago. Because language is evolving so rapidly, will this manual need to be updated more frequently? Well, that's going to be easy, isn't it? Chaz or Amanda?
Absolutely easy. I have to stay in my lane though. So the digital transformation is the Commonwealth agency who had carriage of the project, and I know they've got a really good team looking after the legacy work. But you're absolutely right. We hope that it's not going to be 18 years before the style manual is adjusted again.
Well, and because it's online only, it should be, I won't say effortless, but it should be relatively easy.
And the other thing is that is completely new is people who have views about a particular discussion can provide comments and feedback to the DTA. Fantastic.
Now, this is a very interesting question. Is it still important for students to learn how to write at a higher level, or should we be teaching them to write at a lower, clearer and more readable level? Who'd like to take that?
Both. Both, I'd say.
Yeah.
To be able to operate in language at different levels appropriate to circumstance, I would have thought.
Also, to write at a lower, clearer, more readable level actually isn't necessarily easy.
No, and sometimes, depending on the context of what you're writing, there are specific words and phrases that have, particularly if it's any kind of academic specialisation, if it's the sciences, if it's law, obviously, there's a whole lot of terms that have very specific meanings that there is no simple way of putting. Because it's, you're trying to write persuasive writing within that context.
Yeah, I agree. I think you need both. I teach a course at the ANU called Writing in the Public Sphere, and so I'm mostly teaching students who have learnt to write the kind of essay style, long assignments, to think about different audiences and how you would communicate with those different audiences. So I think both of those skills are absolutely essential. Certainly to teach at university level, and I think important, for lots of academics who write quite esoteric material sometimes, that they know how to communicate that to a broader audience as well. So there's a place for both of those things.
So, Kate, I'll jump in.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think there's the handle that you can just turn and out comes this sausage. Rather, you're guided by, well, what does my audience need? What are the users of this information actually going to do with it, and who are they? How do they read? And so, again, Amanda's example is a really good one. An academic audience, specialist language, just go hard, knock yourself out. For a readership that is a general audience, then you've got to really be thinking about word choice and how you engage, because that readership has a completely different worldview and a completely different language that guides them as they read.
I've just in a second. Thanks, Chaz. There's a question here that follows on quite neatly from that point. The point of communicating is to get a message across. Does it really matter if you use incorrect punctuation, American spelling, etc., if you communicate the message clearly?
How do you know though? That's a problem. So if I'm writing a fiction book, I can use whatever language I like, including made-up words if I want to. That's fine, because I'm hoping that people will get the gist of it. But these are people who are reading for, entertainment, maybe for enlightenment, whatever. I think in government communications, clarity has to be everything. So you may think you're getting the point over totally clearly using incorrect language, and maybe 90% of people are following you, but what about the 10% who don't? And I guess that's one of the reasons behind style guides, is to make sure that communication is as clear as it possibly can be.
Yeah, and there'd certainly be instances where incorrect punctuation may well alter the meaning of what,
there's a famous
you're doing.
Yes.
So,
a famous court case in the US where,
with the
for
comma.
a position of a comma, a judgment was made against.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really important is those basics are a distraction if they're wrong for a large group of readers. I put my hand up on pedantic and particular and distracted very easily, as the people I work with know. And so, we just have a culture, don't put typos and incorrect punctuation up, because I'm of a particular type. They don't say what type I am. I'm relieved about that. So it is a distraction, and the point of communicating clearly is to have people focus on ideas and content rather than commas, rather than organisation with a Z.
This might be our last question. What are the processes, decisions, discussions which happen when changing writing guidelines? How do we know when it's time to change? I think, Amanda, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, well, certainly in the kinds of things that I consulted on for the style manual, a lot of that was determined by usage. So looking at how usage might have changed across time. So a lot of it was based on corpus research, so actually looking at what Australian printed works were doing with various things, like, for example, spelling. I think, so really evidence-based research, I think, is one of the key things there. And as I think I said earlier, I think just there's been this general move towards greater clarity. So some of these things will be determined by some of the things that we've talked about before, like accessibility or, how something might appear online. So that might be something else that comes up. If you're thinking about putting something online, there might be a list of things that come out of that you would then look at adjusting in the style manual.
So it's actually quite a time-consuming process to work all this out.
Yes,
whether it's time to change.
It's based on research, and research can take some time. Some things take a lot more time than others.
Yes.
But definitely, you always want it to be evidence-based, ideally, or for some other reasons. So, for example, accessibility, where again, there's research that's fed into that said that people with, say, vision problems can't see particular things on screen easily. So you adjust, so for example, the numbers using numerals instead of spelled out numbers is an example of that.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there today, unless Chris or Chaz have anything you'd like to add to Amanda's answer?
Forgive me, I'll leap in.
Quickly.
Yeah. The other thing that's been motivated change is actually the plain English movement or plain language movement that has come into its own over the last 20 years. So I could be wrong. So send an email if I am. But I don't think plain English was mentioned in the 2002 6th edition of the Commonwealth Style Manual. Since then, there's been a Plain Language Act in the United States in 2010. There's a whole movement dedicated to the idea that government should not baffle citizens in the documents that they write, which is, I suspect, a really good thing.
Or insurance companies.
Or insurance companies.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much to our guests, the three of you. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, you might be interested in taking part in two free workshops that Chaz is going to be running on the 11th and 12th of November, based on the changes in the Australian Government Style Manual. So go to our website and you can find all the details there. Thank you.